Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership interview series. I could not be more excited today to be introducing Nichelle Maynard-Elliott. Nichelle, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It is my privilege to be here. Looking forward to it.
So let me share your bio briefly so people know who I'm talking to if they haven't come across you before. So Nichelle Maynard-Elliott, the founder and CEO of Dunamis Transaction Advisors, LLC, is an accomplished deal maker and advisor to boards and senior management with over 25 years of extensive financial and legal experience in M&A, business development and strategic alliances. Nichelle is the former head of M&A Americas and Asia Pacific for Praxair Inc., now Lind PLC, and is currently an independent director of Xerox and Lucid Group. Nichelle is a woman of faith, has been married for 30 years to a devoted husband, her biggest cheerleader, and a mother to two amazing adult children who are currently forging their paths in this crazy world. Nichelle, what a pleasure to have you. Can I ask you, for people who haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, tell us who you are as a human being?
Sure, I love that. I am a New Yorker, born and bred of Caribbean parentage. My parents are migrated to the United States from Barbados in the 60s, and was born in Brooklyn, lived in Queens for a few years, and then in Westchester, and that's kind of where I built my life. Went to undergrad in Providence, Rhode Island. Was an economics major, then came back to New York for law school. My thought, although I had originally planned to be a doctor, my thought pretty quickly into college was that I was going to shift to something that was business and law related. So went on to law school in New York and started my career at corporate law firms, where I did a mix of mergers and acquisitions, private equity work, with a little bit of interest in entertainment, actually, because my side passion is music. But then finally settled at M&A and was recruited into the industrial gases company, Praxair, where I spent a number of years there helping them with their roll-up strategy in M&A, and then had an opportunity to transition to the business side of M&A, and was on this path to be global head of M&A, and got a little side call about board service, and had an opportunity to start the next chapter of my career just a couple years ago. And I've been building this board portfolio. That's me professionally. And then, as you know, my wonderful children and my husband, my family, those are the things that are important to me.
Amazing. Now, that is one of the best and most concise overviews of an incredible career. I'm going to take us back and slow it right down now as we step through all of those phases. So, I want to ask about music firstly. Do you still, what do you do musically? Is that still a core part of your life?
It absolutely is. I founded a gospel choir when I graduated from college, came back to my home church. It started that choir. The choir has been going for over 30 years now. We just sang yesterday. And my family, my husband sings, my son is a drummer and sings, my daughter sings. So we've toured internationally. We've done a recording of original music. So I have a lot of fun doing that and sort of expressing my faith in that context. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, well, let's get back to the career side then. And I love that you've got that deep passion. And I think that will probably come out in part of our conversation about having something outside of all of the business and work interests. So you ended up in Praxair in the industrial kind of sector. How did that happen? What drew you there? Tell us that story in the first place.
It's my career is a series of circumstances that were unexpected and unplanned. So, what I did know when I started working in big firms was that I had no intention of being a partner. My goal was really to go and to kind of get my chops and pay my dues, really learn the best. But my goal was always to end up being in-house in a company. And I didn't have a specific industry that I was necessarily targeting. The goal was just that I wanted to have this expansive kind of life outside of my job. I didn't want to be consumed by my work. And I just thought that partnership wasn't going to be something for me. So the goal was to go in, get the experience, and then transition. I really took a cold call from a headhunter to consider this role at Paxter. I didn't know anything about the industrial gases space, but they were, looking at their packaged gases. And so if you think about the oxygen that is in the hospital or the nitrogen that's in the dentist's office, they were rolling. They were rolling up that strategy. They wanted to acquire a lot of mom and pop shops to build that company. So they wanted somebody who had M&A experience there and also in their healthcare business. So that was really how I started at Praxair, and the predecessor to Praxair, some people might know as Union Carbide. So I really went there to just because I could buy or sell anything. Sort of went in as the lawyer to kind of have that as my, what supported my lifestyle outside. And along the way, I kind of was always a deal junkie, but then just fell in love with actually doing deal work and caught the eye of the person who was going to become the global head of M&A for that company. And he recruited me into the department, to the business
So,
side.
looking back, you were quite clear about not wanting to follow the partner track. What was it? You obviously had a perspective at the time of what being a partner looked like.
Yeah, my view was that law firms were very big machines and the pie was limited. And so only a certain number of people were going to get an opportunity. And, you had to convince partners that they needed to slice their piece of pie much thinner.
Yeah.
And there was this, much like investment banking, Melissa, there's just this view that you give them your life and you just, and that wasn't something I was interested in. So from very early on, I knew I was very active, with my choir and my music and my church and my other community activities. And so I wanted to have a life that had balance, and I wanted to have children, and I wanted to be married. So, work at that time was just, this particular pocket of a lot of other things. And I wasn't willing to give that up to pursue partnership. The partners that I saw at the time, in particular, the female partners, had gone through their whole careers and hadn't necessarily had the opportunity to have a life outside of that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in Praxair, you're working as part of the M&A group, and you started getting opportunities to grow in that organization. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate in my career to have some incredible mentors and sponsors. And I developed a relationship with the person who was the head of M&A on the business side for the healthcare business at the time. And then he became the global head of M&A, and we had worked on a lot of transactions together over the course of several years. And he said to me, I'm looking at my group, and I don't see anybody in my group on the business side that I believe would be a good successor for me, but I believe that you have the skills and the ability to do it. And so I was kind of shocked because at that time it was, I'm a really good corporate lawyer. I can do this fairly well. So, am I willing to kind of jump into this space, which is really more the business side and the models and the valuation, and have a lawyer that's sitting next to me at the table doing the legal side of it. So when he first said, I think you could do this and I'd love you to move over to the business side, I actually turned him down the first time.
Yeah.
And my thinking was, my children were small. I didn't want to be doing a lot of global travel, although my mom was helping us raise our children so I could pursue my career. My thought was, I don't really think I want to do that. So I said, no, I'm going to pass. And I continued doing the work, on in the law department, sort of being his right hand, his lawyer. And then a couple of years later, he came back and he said, listen, I really think that you can do this. You are the best qualified person for this. He showed me statistics about, how heads of M&A can be have legal backgrounds as much as they can have business backgrounds. He said, you just have the ability to do this. You have your legal background and your business, and what you don't have, I'm willing to teach you. So with that, I went back, sort of consulted with my husband and said, I think maybe I'll take this leap. And what was amazing was that he was somebody who saw something in me before I saw it in myself. So that's one of the pieces of advice I always give to people. If there are people that you respect and you respect their opinions, if they see something in you and an ability in you, then you should trust them. And then the boss that I was leaving was an incredible mentor and sponsor as well. And he said to me, sucks for us, the law department loses you, but I think it's a great opportunity. So I send you off with all blessing. And that was how I got to the business side of M&A.
How amazing to, as you said, I mean, he really painted that vision for you and took away all of the, I guess, all of the question marks you had in your head about could I make this leap? So amazing to have that sort of sponsor. I wonder, along the way, were there things that I'm always interested in people's relationships with feedback and growth? And I think feedback gets a bad name because often people think feedback's just going to be constructive and whatever else. But can you think of along the way in your career a piece of feedback that you needed to hear but might not have wanted to, and how that helped you grow?
Yeah, this was a great question because there are probably a couple of things that really ring out to me as being moments where I really had to stop and take stock. And this one particular conversation I had with a new general counsel, so I was still in the law department. I had established a reputation, and people liked to work with me, and I was doing other things in other departments, and getting kind of recognition in the company. But this new general counsel came in and he said, you strike me as a shrinking violet. You're like a shrinking violet. And exactly, that was my reaction, because I'm like, look, I've sung in front of thousands of people. I'm always out there in the forefront. I am by no means a shrinking violet. But it was an interesting both perspective and tool he used. Now, he was the kind of teacher, mentor who would kind of poke you a little to really challenge you to say, you need to step out all the more. So I took that back and initially very offended by it. And I said, this guy doesn't know me. So now I'm going to have to prove him wrong. But it was one of the greatest pieces of advice that I got, because it helped me to strengthen my voice, to own my space in the room and my contribution in the room. And you have to walk a line, I think, honestly, in particular as women, between, having a voice that's respected and sharing that voice, and not presenting yourself as the smartest person in the room. And that's not just true for women, that's true for everybody. But he just gave me that nudge that kind of said, okay, own your space. And that's what I did.
I love that. And for the listeners, before I raised my eyebrows and kind of smiled when Nichelle referenced the shrinking violet. So, and if you can't see the conversation, she's here in gorgeous purple. So it all just fits together beautifully. But Nichelle, um, that point is so critical that you said about that fine line that people work about finding their voice.
Mhm.
Can I get you to maybe elaborate a little on that? Because I think there'll be so many people listening to this today who are like, either get that feedback, but then don't know how to walk that line. Like, what would you suggest? Is there anything you would think of to share with people there?
For me, it is about fine-tuning your EQ, knowing the room that you're in, knowing the audience that you are speaking to, understanding what they expect from you in terms of what you can contribute. And I think this goes a long way in the board context as well, right? So I walk into the room and I remind myself, and I am often throughout my career, one, if not, a few, one of the only person of color, only woman in the room, but I have an expertise and I have something to contribute. And if I don't make that contribution, then I've wasted time and space, my own and the other people in the room, right? So I really look at, we always go in prepared, but I listen to the conversation and get the cadence and the sense of the people in the room and understand, when and how it makes sense to make a contribution. Because in some cases, you can kind of, people love a lot of, argumentative is not the word, but love the challenge. So you can challenge in a certain way that, fosters great discussion and moves the conversation forward. There are other places where people have big egos, and you've got to manage the egos and know how to do that. So it really is a matter of being very attuned and aware of what's happening around you, and how people respond. And then also knowing I'm here to make a contribution, and the contribution that I have, nobody else has.
Mm.
So I've got to say my piece, because that's what makes it better.
So let's go back to Praxair then. So you've decided that, yep, I'm going to step forward into the business side of M&A and set myself up to lead this function. Tell us, let's resume the chat about that. Where did that take you from there?
Sure. So this was a 5-year plan that I had with the global head of M&A, the CEO of the company, all of the senior team was signed on. We're going to, do this in 5 years. My boss is going to ride off into the sunset, and I'm going to have this role that's a direct report to the CEO, $15 billion company, a very exciting opportunity. And we started this process of, me really going along with my boss and training and being trained and shadowing him for that time. And then about 4 years into that 5-year plan, we got a call from Linde, the largest industrial glasses company globally, German company, and they wanted to merge with our company. So it was at once good news and bad news because it was an amazing opportunity. We were combining these two companies. There were going to be divestitures in 70 countries, an experience professionally like I had never had before. But the reality was that once the company was combined, it was going to be a global company that was, I think, at the end of the deal, $70 billion in revenue. So a very different scenario. It was the last transformational transaction in the space. So that meant that M&A wasn't going to have the same experience or same level of importance as it had in the smaller company. And so my boss kept saying to me, "Oh, but it's going to be great. Of course, you're going to get my job when I go." And I said, "Listen, when the dust settles, there's probably going to be half German executives, half US executives. Not so sure this is going to be, play out the way we want." And so sure enough, the deal closed and he was retiring, but M&A was going to be put under a person in a strategic role. And that person didn't have a lot of M&A experience. So it wasn't what it was kind of positioned to me in the beginning to be. So thankfully, I had the year before gotten an opportunity to serve on the board of a public company, and I saw my opportunity to jump into something different.
So was that the impetus then to move across to board roles? Was that the sort of
Yes.
intentional decision at that point? Okay. So let's start that journey then. What prompted that idea? You obviously already had the one public board on the go, but how did you kick that off?
Yeah, and I will go back to that first board actually, because I always tell people that that opportunity was one that came to me about a decade before I was even seriously thinking about board service. I had an opportunity to interact with board members because I did board presentations for deals. And so there were certain people on the Praxair board that I had a very high level of respect for. And I thought maybe someday I'd like to do that. I'd like to have that kind of influence over high potential talent, over people that are coming up through the organization and advising at that level strategically. So I just happened to mention to a friend that, we had done a deal together 15 years prior as very early lawyers. And we came back around and met each other in a different circumstance. She was now the general counsel of FactSet. And I just threw away this comment and said, "Oh, someday I'd like to serve on a board." She introduced me to somebody she had gone to college with who was a serial acquirer, who was looking to add somebody to his board. He had no women on the board. He needed someone with M&A experience and chemicals experience. So I checked all those boxes, had that opportunity. And then I kept in the back of my mind that people kept saying, "Well, once you have your first public board, the other boards will come." So when we get to 2019 and the whole merger is kind of happening and everything's settling, I say, I think I have an opportunity here to step away from this role and do something else. So prayerful consideration, conversation with my husband, everything, I decide that I'm going to leave Praxair. And that was 2019, then COVID hit in 2020.
Bang.
So a very interesting time because I told you, Melissa, I joke that I met more people during COVID professionally than I had in the prior 10 years of my career because I was absolutely intentional about connecting with every person that I could find. I would join webinars and sort of scroll through and see who the attendees were and look them up on LinkedIn and just reach out and say, "Hey, I'd love 15 minutes of your time. Just tell me a little bit about your board journey." And I just started to develop this network. And I told everybody that I knew, every investment banker I had worked for, every corporate lawyer that we had worked with, retired executives, and people just started to generously open up their Rolodex to me and introduce me to people. So that was how the Xerox opportunity came along. A retired executive introduced me to somebody who introduced me to somebody who was on the Xerox board. And then the conversation happens, they start to engage the HP merger conversation, and they want somebody with transformational transaction experience to be on that board. So they put me on that slate. And then a year later, they call me to be on the board of Xerox.
Amazing. Now, who's Ira? Because I remember when we first met, you said to me that part of the inspiration around, moving into boards was to be like Ira. So, who is Ira?
Yeah, so Ira Hall is this accomplished African American executive. He had worked for Texaco for a number of years, served on a lot of boards, and he was on the board of Praxair. And what I really appreciated about Ira was that he had a good relationship with the CEO, but was always challenging him in the area of diversity. What are who are the high potentials? How can I interact with them? How can I engage them? How can I be a good mentor to them, or at least a good example to them? And what I came to find out later, and Ira has since passed, but what I found out later was that what Ira was doing at Praxair, he was doing in various corporate settings in corporate America in the US. So you will hear people like Ursula Burns talk about Ira being a great influence. Other African American executives that were coming up that Ira took a kind of took interest in. So he met me when I went to a board dinner or a high potential board dinner and presented. And, he would always kind of every once in a while say, "Hey, how are you doing? How are things going?" So when you talk about those people who are your sponsors in the room when you're not in the room, Ira was one of those people. And I said to myself, he was the director. I said, I would like to be like him someday.
How do you do that now as part of your board roles? Or do you do that now as part of
Absolutely, because I feel that it's part of my purpose for being in these boardrooms. And in particular, now that we've gone from this phase of, diversity, equity, inclusion, and ESG being positive to now being a bad word. I said at the beginning of the process, this is either a movement or it's a moment. And if it's a moment and some of us get through the door, it's going to be very important that when we hold seats of power, that we will also not just open the door or leave the door open for others, but invite them in and encourage they're coming in. So what I do is I have good relationships not only with the general counsels, but with the people who are VP of people or chief human resources officers at the companies on whose boards I serve. In both cases, I sit on the compensation committee. So I have encourage the expansion of the remit to be not just compensation, but compensation and human capital. I ask questions about, who are your high potentials, who are not just the people who are succeeding the CEO, but a couple of,
Yes.
rungs down in the organization. And then how can I be of service? How can I help? So with their employee resource groups, I make myself available. I do fireside chats. When they come together for meetings, I try to say, would love to be there. And so I started to do that at Xerox because Xerox has a culture. I mean, they started the first employee resource group in the United States some 50 years ago. So they have a culture that is like very much, DEI supporting diversity, inclusion, belonging, they call it. So I would start to attend their meetings, and we just had a senior leadership team with our new board where the entire board did a panel. And the employees just loved it, that having access to directors, appropriate access, but how can I be of help to you? How can I help you with your career? How can I coach? How can I sponsor other executive women? Just help them in their journey.
That sounds incredible. Now, I would just love to work out how did you work out how to package yourself up for a board role? Because it was interesting what you said earlier about ticking the boxes. Boards can be quite specific, which is a positive thing in terms of what they're looking for. But how do people work out? And I would say, because I know you do a lot of work with women who are looking to move on to boards, but particularly if they have more of a general background, the people who've come up maybe through operating streams, not legal or not financial.
Yeah, I think general backgrounds actually can serve you better because there was a time just a few years ago when they were really only looking for sitting and retired CEOs and CFOs. So if you had that opportunity, great for you. Obviously, not a lot of sitting CEOs had that opportunity, but I encourage people to look at the board skills matrix, particularly of public companies that talk about what skills they are looking for, the skills that the current directors have. Then I review publicly available documents, or if it's a private company, anything I can get my hands on that tell me what the strategy of the company is. Because what you want to do is identify your superpowers and then match those superpowers to the opportunity that you're looking for. So a generalist or someone who says, well, I've got operational experience, but I've also got sales experience and I've got go-to-market experience. Those are great things. So depending on the company that you are interested in, you kind of say, okay, well, here's how I show up. Here's how I package myself in this situation. So for me as a lawyer, because I was a lawyer, I have governance experience. So some of my boards like the governance experience that I have and the ability to understand, regulatory frameworks and environments. So that might be a way I would package myself for that opportunity. But for another company that's doing a transformational transaction, then I'm going to lean on my M&A experience. So it's really a matter of, knowing what they're looking for. And when I get inbound calls now and people say, hey, this company is interested in you, the first thing I ask is, well, what are they interested in? Because
Yes.
then I'm going to cater the way I present myself to what it is that they're looking for and what they think my strengths are. And not that you then go up into the room and only be that. Like, I'm not only an M&A expert. I can bring other pieces, but I know that first and foremost, they have me showing up for M&A, or they have me showing up for legal, or they have me showing up, finance, operations, marketing, you name it. Know what that first thing is that they want from you, and then add a couple of other areas of strength that you have.
Where do you suggest people start when they're looking to make that move? I think one of the things I picked up already was you started earlier than you were really contemplating that move at all, probably before you were even contemplating that move.
Right. Right. I really encourage particularly younger executives to always be thinking about this. You should be thinking about it as your end game. We talked about, maybe the generation before us talked about retiring and sort of sailing off into the sunset. And we don't, now we just sort of do the next chapter, right? And I think board service is an incredible next chapter because it keeps your mind sharp. It keeps you, in spaces where you can learn different industries and different things. So when you're an executive in your 30s or in your 40s, have board service in mind and think about what types of professional development opportunities I would want to have so that expands my remit, right? So I'm not just going to be solely focused on finance for my entire career, but if there's an opportunity, here in this company for me to go from finance to something that's tangential or something that's a side space or sales or something else, get a lot of different opportunities, I think is important. And then just be intentional about what you're doing, because I've found a lot of people I've spoken to in the recent years I want to be on a board because everybody thinks being on a board is some new great thing, but they don't really know what that means and they don't invest the time in finding out what that means, right? So you want to be on a board. What do you think that means? What does that look like for you? What type of board? Everybody knows the publicly traded companies, but there are private boards and there's private equity and there's, venture capital and there are all these different spaces that you can play in. So get yourself educated about what opportunities are out there and how your skills marry and measure with certain opportunities, and then pursue them. Be intentional is the other thing. Just I'm going to be focused about what I want to do here and who I want to connect with, how I network, how I get my name out there so that the opportunities can come to me.
I heard you say earlier that the CEO of Praxair suggested that you could step into that role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, did you ever consider stepping into, I mean, you are a CEO now, but did you consider at the time stepping into CEO roles?
So yeah, so just to clarify, he was supportive of me being the head of M&A. He hadn't said he's CEO. So I just want to be clear.
Oh, I'm
But
going to add that on. I'm sure you could have been CEO wherever you decided to go. Did it cross your
my,
mind?
my husband, the great cheerleader, always says you could absolutely be a CEO wherever you go. So I will say that to be honest, Melissa, I hadn't thought about it because I was very specific about where my skills were, and I saw myself more as an advisor to the number one and that may just be my legal background, just the sort of the places I find my strength. So I had not really thought about it, but I certainly cheered along some other women along the way who I knew are absolute amazing candidates to be CEO.
You know, one of my passions as a former CEO is to encourage more females to step into those roles. What's your perspective on why we don't have more female CEOs?
You know, I think it's a couple things. I can give a general answer first, which is I think that for as long as men hold the majority of CEO and leadership positions, they must step up and continue to sponsor women and support women because we're in a stage now where everybody wants to hold on to their power. And I'm hoping that some of these men, because like I said, I've had great sponsors, I've had great mentors, I've had great people that have stepped aside and said, you could do this and I'm going to support you to do that. So that is sort of the external, here's what men can do to help. I think we as women need to be open to the possibility. So I suppose maybe if I had thought at 30 something, wow, I want to pursue CEO, that is something that I would have been more intentional about. It just didn't occur to me. So I'm hoping that more women are mindful that, listen, just like you can you can be the chairperson of a board of a company, you can certainly be the CEO of a company and go for it, right? And don't allow yourself to be limited by what you perceive to be your lack of qualifications, because as we always say, women believe they have to be 80% qualified before they'll go for something, and men 50%, they're like, okay, I can do it, so really, really believe in yourself. Don't be afraid to make the mistakes, because everybody's going to make the mistakes, but just go for it. So that's kind of my general answer. But the other piece that I would add, Melissa, to be candid, as I know some incredible leaders who I think are being passed over for opportunities. I think the reality is that there's a view that a CEO has a certain, not just physical appearance, but just the CEO has to be this guy who's the athlete, who's the whatever. And I think we as women just come in different packages and bring different strengths that people are not yet appreciating. And we need to get people to see and understand that a CEO doesn't have to be, it's not just that person that wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning and works out before they come to, we gotta break that mold, I think is the answer, because there are a lot of great female leaders out there.
What do you look for? So as a board director across a number of boards, what would you call out as the key things you look for in a CEO?
Look, I think expertise in an area and the ability to be a utility player, having had experience in different spaces is important. But the things that are more important to me are leadership qualities. I think that, I've seen some incredibly high-performing CEOs who have humility and have the ability to share their celebrations and their victories with their teams. One of the things I said, you might have seen, advice given. I think that the people who are generous with accountability, or generous with success, and stingy with blame, you take the blame for yourself when it's your team. You're like, hey, I've seen some amazing CEOs in difficult situations say, that's on me. It's my team that did it, but that's on me. And when there's a celebration, they may have been the ones doing 80% of the work, but they say, I congratulate my team because I couldn't have done it without my team. So those are the kinds of leadership qualities, empathy, and I hate to sound corporate with those buzzwords, but those things really matter. I've seen some other leaders who are absolutely just completely consumed and have a level of pride that gets in the way and creates a toxic environment, easy to blame everybody else for what's going wrong. That's just a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so how do you know when a team's on track to perform well? From a board level, what are the things that give you confidence that the team have got it?
I think it's how you can tell from the way they present in the boardroom. You can tell from the way they interact together as a team. I am a very strong proponent, if you haven't already heard, for how the team performs together. Because I do not believe, there are no rock stars, there are rock bands. Like everybody has a place has an instrument, has a role to play. So I find when people are committed to the mission and they are expressing they're committed to the mission and they follow the leader who says, I'm right ahead of you, take this hill with me. Those are the teams that I think do well. I think the teams where, again, the leader separates himself or herself from everybody else and kind of says, well, these people aren't doing a good job and it's their fault. I think that's a challenge. Now, I will also say that it's important that that CEOs have a healthy measure of pessimism in what they do, because the team can be so excited about something that they can overpromise and underdeliver. And that's a bad thing if it happens quarter after quarter, right? So how are you able to come and present to the board, here's the mid case, here's the best case with the upside, and then here's the worst case, because those are the questions that the directors are always going to ask you. So what if your revenues are half of that? What if your costs are twice that? What are you going to do? So be prepared for the worst case scenario. That's when you see good leaders and good teams that can respond, that have anticipated those questions and can respond to them.
Never underestimate the power of a good forecast.
Exactly. Exactly. Get a lot of credit.
Nichelle, how have you, you talked about the gospel choir earlier, but what are the things that bring you joy? How have you navigated this incredible career and stayed sane and healthy?
Yeah, really, first and foremost, my faith. I'm a morning person. I'm up with prayer and meditation. I try to exercise as much as I can because I think those times for me are times that I can clear my mind and prepare for the day. Very, very important, and sort of tackle the stuff that comes my way and not be so overwhelmed by it. My family's, we love to travel together. So any opportunity we can get, that was one thing I did. As much as I was willing to work the long hours and law firms and everything, I would always take my vacation time. I strongly recommend that people take their vacation time. And when you take your vacation time, unfortunately, sometimes we have to have our laptop or our phones with us, but take the time to be present with the people that you love and the people that support you, because they're the ones that will carry you through the difficult times. And those memories of those great vacations and those great times you've had together, make it a little easier when the times are tough and you got a lot on your plate.
We could go on for a really long time, Nichelle. I've just loved the chance to, get to know you and to have this conversation. I know the audience will be loving it too. But the final question I ask everyone in an interview is, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you? And do you think it needs to change?
Yes. So brave feminine leadership is the courage to show up authentically with all of who you are, right? I make no apologies that I am an African American woman. I make no apologies that I'm a wife and a mother and a daughter, because I believe all of those things pour into that. I'm a woman of faith, pour into who I am. I do not believe in compartmentalizing my life. I try to have people overlap and meet each other and connect, because I want to be the same person that I am at church as the person that I am at work, as the person that I am on the playground or wherever. So there's that. The point about finding your voice, critical, know that your contribution is unique and you need to lean into that. And then the final piece, as I alluded to earlier, is it's not sufficient just to leave the door open for the people coming behind you. It's part of your responsibility to groom those folks, to encourage them, to cause them to be better and be what they can be. And so do I think that needs to change? I think some of it is changing, because I think we might have talked, Melissa, about how maybe a couple of decades ago there was the queen bee syndrome, and women felt that once they were in the room that they were fine because they were the only one in the room. No, that's never the case, right? There can never be too many of us, in spaces with different, viewpoints and perspectives and diverse opinions, because that's what makes teams perform better. So I think we're doing better with that as women, in leadership. But I think that's going to need to continue to evolve, particularly in the climates that we are in now, that we're going to have to force the results and not just the talk about being in diverse spaces.
Nichelle Maynard-Elliott, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining the conversation, and thank you for being an incredible supporter of upcoming talent.
Thank you, Melissa. It has been my pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation.